Hi, I'm Eric Ames, Waco author and historian, and I'm here today to talk to you about the Waco Tornado Walk. In 2017, I started working with Ashley Bean Thornton from Waco Walks, and we led walks through downtown Waco to walk through the path of the tornado of 1953 and examine the impact of what it did to downtown and to the greater Waco area. Today would have been the 4th anniversary of that walk. However, due to the COVID-19 situation, we're not able to have large groups assemble, and so it's not safe to do the walk this year. I'm excited that my friends at HWF have allowed me to come and do video versions of the walk so that everyone can access them through the web. May 11th, 1953 dawned as a gray, warm, humid day. The Waco newspapers reported the day before there'd been a tornado from a line of storms in Minnesota, but because of an old Indian legend, they had no fear that anything would strike in Waco because the Native Americans who lived here had said no big storms had ever come through Waco and therefore they never would. So the people of Waco were very comfortable with the fact that they thought things would be safe, even if a large line of storms was approaching. The day proceeded on. It was still hot and humid, a typical spring day. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a large storm cell had blown up to the south of town and began to proceed north toward downtown Waco. People were already down shopping. They were doing their daily activities. It was a day when lots of activity was happening in stores all across downtown. Downtown was a vibrant area at that time. And so as the storm approached, there wasn't a lot of concern. It was one of those storms where the clouds were low and heavy, the wind whipped rain around, so you weren't able to see much. You could tell a storm was coming, but it wasn't something to be particularly concerned about at that point. However, by about 4:30 that afternoon, a massive tornado, an F5 on the Fujita scale, touched down in downtown Waco. Immediately, it began to wreak havoc and destruction all across downtown. It tore a path through the center of the city. When it hopped across the Brazos River into North Waco and headed across out of town, it left 114 people dead, 600 people injured, and millions of dollars in damage all across downtown and the greater Waco area. Nothing like this had ever happened in the history of Waco in terms of a natural disaster. It still ranks as the second most deadly tornado in Texas history and one of the top 11 deadliest natural disasters in American history. It's hard to overestimate how much destruction and damage this storm wrought on Waco. Years later, this tornado memorial was erected by the city of Waco to pay homage to the people who died in that storm. It was sponsored by the Phipps Memorial Company on LaSalle. The reverse lists all 114 names of those who died in the storm. The front contains a quote from Lord Byron and some information about the storm in memory of those who perished. Even today in 2020, the effects of that storm are still seen. If you look through downtown, you'll notice there are gaps in the built environment. Many of those gaps exist because of something that the tornado tore down over 60 years ago. Others were left there because the storm damage was replaced by development or urban renewal in the 1960s. You can't walk through downtown without spotting the after effects of that storm. And so with the Waco Walks, Tornado Walks, we take people on an 8-stop tour through downtown to discuss different locations relating to the storm. Our next stop is going to be at the Suspension Bridge, where we'll discuss the section of town known as Bridge Street. Our second stop is Bridge Street. Behind me is the Waco Suspension Bridge, opened in 1870 as a toll bridge and then gifted to the city and the county some years later as a free bridge for pedestrians to cross. The bridge itself wasn't damaged in the tornado. However, the area around the bridge was heavily damaged. The area known as Bridge Street was an old commercial area in Waco that dated back to the 1870s. It was primarily wooden structures, and so they weren't sturdy and built to the same level of structural integrity as some of the more modern buildings built in the 40s and 50s. So when the tornado hopped across downtown, it skipped past the Suspension Bridge, but it did a large amount of damage to an area that we'll talk about next, Bridge Street. Bridge Street sits in the area where the Waco Convention Center and the Hilton Hotel are today. The name Bridge Street, of course, comes from the fact that the street ran across the bridge and into the downtown square area. Bridge Street was primarily a business area owned by African Americans. It was a multicultural area. A number of those buildings were early Waco buildings that had been into a second generation of ownership, or even a third, depending on the age of the structure. And so it was a very diverse neighborhood. It was commercial. There were a lot of barbershops, domino halls, pool halls, cultural establishments, restaurants, a very thriving center and part of town. However, the tornado changed that. Because they were primarily wooden structures, the tornado destroyed the majority of the buildings in that area. There are some stories that show up in the oral histories, particularly those gathered by Roger Conger, who was mayor of Waco many years ago. One of which he recounts as the crews were removing the rubble from the Bridge Street area 3 days after the storm. He claims that a scoop from a front-end loader dug into a pile of rubble and picked up the dirt and rocks and brick and wood And inside that scoop was a man who was still alive 3 days after the storm. Now, Conger backs himself up a little bit and says, I can't say for certain that he survived, but I believe that he did. And that's the kind of history that sometimes we have to deal with this storm. There's a lot of oral tradition. There's a lot of things that people think they remember, or maybe they remember accurately, that get written down. And so those are a lot of the sources we have for what happened with the storm from '53. What we can confirm is that the buildings in this area were essentially completely destroyed. Photos from the time after the storm show just a flat pile of rubble and sticks essentially left from the Bridge Street area. If we hadn't had that destruction, we might not have had the rebuilding that we had later when we got the convention center and the Hilton, but it was a high price to pay. It destroyed a very vibrant African-American multicultural neighborhood for time moving forward up to now. Our next stop is further down University Parks, where we'll talk about what happened with the rubble from the storm.